Hello, well I'm Adam Long with the Board Director with the National LGBT Federation, and I'm here with Minister for Equality. Well, you have quite a detailed brief, don't you, Roderic? But for the purposes of this interview, I suppose equality would be your main brief, and it's Pride Month, as people are aware, and as part of that, as we've been doing now for the last number of years, we have a Pride Leaders Series interview, where we talk with leading political figures about where I suppose key policy priorities for the LGBT community stand. So without further ado, I think, again, welcome Roderic.
Thanks very much, and thanks for having me on again.
Yeah, it's always a pleasure. And of course, you're of the community, so it makes it even more, I think, appropriate. So as you know, with your busy brief, there's a lot of kind of pressing topics that the community is looking, to see progress on. Mm-hmm. I know that there are a number of initiatives that you're very keen to prioritise. So perhaps if we start maybe with what is something that you've really kind of been championing, really, I think, is the whole issue of so-called conversion practices. Mm-hmm. This very kind of discredited, it's so-called therapy, but of course we know it's not therapy, and it's it's really damaging and it's really dangerous. And I know that your department has been working on that now for quite a while. So perhaps, Roderic, if I could, what's the update there essentially, and where does that stand?
Thanks very much. Well, look, we have undertaken over the course of last year a piece of research that was led by the School of Nursing in Trinity College to get a better understanding of how conversion practices take place in Ireland. I suppose the one positive thing to take from that is they're not hugely common in Ireland, and that's good, but they do happen. And we know that where they happen, their impact can be deeply, deeply harmful on a young LGBTI plus person. And it's for that reason, it's for the reason that conversion practices harm people, that we're looking to bring in legislation that will outlaw them, that will prohibit them. And this will bring Ireland in step with many other countries who are taking similar measures. We've been looking at what other countries are doing, but we also have to design a law that recognises, I suppose, the distinct elements of the Irish legal system and recognises, I suppose, where conversion practices are taking place. As you know, there is a legislative proposal already that was brought forward by Senator Fintan Warfield. Yes. I know the previous Attorney General had a concern about some elements of that. So we're looking, I suppose, just to bring forward our own proposal that we believe will be constitutionally secure, but will also be effective in terms of protecting members of the LGBTI plus community from these practices. So my hope is that before we break for the summer, before the cabinet breaks for the summer, we'll have brought forward the key policy proposals and gotten cabinet approval for the drafting. We'd hope to draft it over the summer. We'd have then going into the autumn pre-legislative scrutiny, where is the opportunity for the Oireachtas Committee to look through it before it actually goes into the Oireachtas and discuss it. And I'm sure, and I think you and I both know, lots of groups will have views on this, and there'll probably be quite a lot of submissions on that. And we would hope to have it, going into the Dáil maybe before the end of this year and pass through all houses by 2024. So that's I suppose the kind of running order as I see it at the moment.
But you're very keen, I suppose, to see that, and I know you spoke at there was an International Day, Day, against homophobia, transphobia, and so forth. And yes, I think it's something clearly that it's good to note, as you did in your speech on that occasion, that it's not hugely common, but it does occur. And I think there was research commissioned, as you referenced, which actually was quite harrowing, I would say, because we read that, and people in the community did see some of that, and it's hugely traumatizing. And I suppose, as you say, it's very clear that no reputable medical or scientific organisation stand over this practice, and it really doesn't have any place in a civilized society. But I suppose when you talk about it being effective, isn't that really the key thing? I think there is broad support for a ban on this practice. But if for the community, certainly I know that there are kind of a number of key elements. One is that it's fully inclusive of our community, and I suppose if you can, you've been strong in that. But again, if you want to kind of reassure our viewers,
yes, the policy proposal will be to outlaw conversion practices on the grounds of sexual orientation, but also on the grounds of gender identity as well. I think we have to be very clear that it will be inclusive. I think it is also clear, though, what the law isn't going to cover, and it is not an attempt to, I suppose, interfere in genuine medical or genuinely, properly regulated engagements between an individual and a medical professional or a therapist or a counsellor when these are done. We all know, many people have struggled with their sexuality, many people have struggled with their gender identity, and, they're entitled, and the therapist is entitled to have a proper engagement in terms of exploring that. And we're not in any way looking to interfere with this. What we are concerned about are practices where the outcome on the part of one person is predetermined. Their aim going in is to change, is to suppress, is to interfere with a person's gender identity or sexual orientation, and that those are the practices we're looking to prohibit. And I suppose I have a concern when you look at the debates in other countries that there will be an attempt to portray what we're doing here as something different. So that's why I think it's important for me and for government to state very clearly what we are doing, but also what we're not doing.
And I note actually just recently that Iceland, in a very, it's very welcome. They've become the latest country now to actually prohibit this appalling practice. A practice, as you know, that's been deemed a form of torture actually against the LGBT plus community by the United Nations. And of course the religious rapporteur, because as you say, there will be attempts, I think, unfortunately, and we see this, and I think that we'll discuss this further in the interview, trying to kind of introduce other issues by proxy, that kind of culture war backdrop, which unfortunately we've seen gain ground more so in other countries. And I think, and I'm sure you would agree, that we would do well to resist that, and I suppose to focus on the realities of the legislation, whether it be hate crime, conversion practices, and what that's intended to do.
And I suppose that's why, for me, it was important that we undertake the research to get, I suppose, a basis and an understanding of what is happening in Ireland at the moment, because, I'm aware there will be attempts to, muddy the waters in terms of what we're trying to do in this legislation, and it was important to show this is a real problem that we're dealing with. It is not impacting a lot of people, and that's good, but it is impacting some people, and it can impact them deeply, and that's why we're taking the step of passing legislation. And look, that's maybe slowed down the process, the fact that we undertook that research, but I think it was the right thing to do in terms of being able to bring forward a clear body of evidence about why the government needs to legislate against these practices.
Okay. And just to get it, I suppose another kind of reassurance you could say that the community is keen to receive is that it covers all settings. So as you say, it's as exploratory therapy or discussions, of course, are very important, and they're supportive. They help people along in their journey of self-discovery. I think as Mary McAleese described it, our former president. But I think whether it's in I think it's if you could clarify this point, whether it's in a medical setting, whether it's in a religious setting, whatever guise this takes, there won't be, I would hope and I would presume, opt-outs depending on the setting where this happens. So if there is kind of a predetermined attempt to suppress or change or predetermine somebody's identity, their gender or their sexual identity, that will be prohibited.
Well, we're working on the definitions now, and because we know these practices take place in a broad range of settings, we just need to kind of work carefully to make sure it is inclusive, that it covers key areas. So we have a bit more work to do in that context. But what we are trying to do is address all situations where individuals are trying to suppress a person's or indeed erase a person's sexual orientation or gender identity, and the law will be designed in that way.
So there won't be, I suppose, kind of carve-outs per se. I know that was an issue, let's say, in England and Wales, you know, and it became quite controversial there, where there was kind of exemptions for, you know, kind of religious settings, because you're right, it doesn't happen in just one setting, but I think the concern, you know, traditionally is that it would take place kind of under a religious kind of guise. Yeah. And I think if that wasn't...
There won't be general carve-outs. Obviously... and particularly, I suppose, when you're dealing with adults who have the right to consent to something maybe we don't agree with, we have to recognise that there are balances here, and if adult consents to do something in terms of their freedom, exercising their freedom of religion, we just have to make sure we get the balance right there between a person exercising their own constitutional rights as a consenting adult. But you know, there aren't going to be any kind of broad carve-outs or broad
whether it be religious or medical, or the law will apply kind of to all settings. I think that is an important kind of clarification, because I think you're right. There will be attempts, I think, our attempts to muddy the waters, and we need to have this legislation to be watertight. And I think that's why that more kind of considered kind of approach, ultimately, if the legislation is better for it, I think that's quite good. Just in terms of the consent, I think it's interesting, you know, and you would be aware of Jane Ozanne, you know, who spoke at I think a number of events. You know, she's a survivor of this therapy, an evangelical Christian, and she's very, very strong on that consent can't be kind of misconstrued in this context, because she said on paper she consented, quote unquote, and most, I suppose, victims of this abuse would kind of, you know, on one level consent, but it's not a genuine consent, and it's, you know, consent, you can't consent to that level of abuse, and that's quite important.
And that's a really difficult part of how we design this law, and just have to, you know, can't understate the challenges here. Where you have someone who is, on the face of it, consenting to, you know, perhaps they believe they don't wish to be gay, or they don't wish to be trans. So how we design a law in such a way that addresses that issue. So that's why, you know, that work is ongoing there at the moment. That is a challenge, and I'm kind of aware of I suppose the different views on that. But we're looking to bring forward the most comprehensive and most protective piece of legislation that we can, that addresses the ultimate harm.
Well, that they're important kind of, you know, clarifications. Just finally, before we move on to another topic, is there any particular, you know, I mentioned that a number of countries now are banning, you know, this practice, and I know, for example, I think that the French approach, which again was a comprehensive ban, you know, there was no opt-outs of any kind really. I think Canada has quite a good law. Is there any particular kind of jurisdiction that you're looking to in terms of best practice?
No, we've looked at a lot of jurisdictions, and I suppose particularly when you look at kind of the continental European countries, they have a civil law system, a code system, and it's difficult to kind of make a comparison with what they're doing, particularly because ours is very much case law based, and we've a lot of case law because we are, you know, we're bringing in criminal prohibitions here, and you know, when you do that, you have to, you know, very clearly set out how the offence is proved, what are the defences, and all of those elements. So, you know, we've looked at the European versions. We'll also look at common law jurisdictions like Canada, like New Zealand, for example. But we are very much designing a law that is, I suppose, very applicable to the Irish situation. So I couldn't say it's, you know, directly comparable to any one other jurisdiction.
Okay. Well, we await that and we'll be following that. So again, absolutely. The timeline, hopefully, you think it'll be progressed. You're bringing it to Cabinet before the summer break.
Clear proposals from Cabinet before summer break. Work over the summer in terms of getting the heads of the bill together. Hopefully into pre-legislative scrutiny early in the autumn term. Hopefully into the Oireachtas into one house before the end of the year, and hopefully passed in 2024.
Great. And again, I suppose the key thing, and we say this with all the issues, is to focus on the substantive issue and not to get distracted by other narratives or kind of by other kind of issues. Okay, well, I suppose another very important issue, and it's certainly timely because, you know, the hate crime, the hate offences bill that's going through the Oireachtas at the moment, and it's kind of reaching its kind of, you know, conclusion, kind of its latter stages. Yeah. And actually, it was in the Seanad yesterday, and I and colleagues of mine were watching that closely. I know it doesn't directly kind of come under the remit of your department, but I'm sure, Roderic, you have very strong views on it.
Well, it's hugely important. The hate crime legislation is something that this government has sought to bring in to protect, whether it's members of the LGBTI plus community, black and mixed race, people in Ireland, people with a disability, women, travellers. We know hate crimes are taking place and taking place with far too great regularity in our country right now. And we are an outlier compared to the rest of Europe in terms of not having clear legislative prohibitions. And I think the law that we have introduced is one by bringing in an aggravated offence where someone attacks you or damages your property, not as a kind of a random event, but solely because you're gay or because you're black, that the law has to recognise that, because hate crimes are designed to silence others. Absolutely. They're designed to push others, to marginalise others. We've seen that throughout history in terms of the use of hate-based crime. And that's why it's so important that Ireland passes this law. I think it's been well designed. I think it's gone through very significant discussion at pre-legislative scrutiny in the Dáil. No doubt it'll go through robust discussion in the Seanad, but I think it is really important, and I look forward to, certainly by the end of this year, that this legislation will be on our statute books.
Absolutely, and I think it's been a key kind of community priority for many years now. It's certainly by no means rushed. I think that there was an argument being made that there's more time needed for this legislation, but I mean, as in 2016, for example, the Burning Issues report into the views and the priorities of the community, kind of post-marriage equality, actually even then showed that the need for hate crime legislation was the top legislative issue. So I think it's something that in many ways the community has been waiting kind of too long for, and I think that's something that would be kind of broadly acknowledged. And you also talk about I suppose hate attacks that are occurring. I mean, the official figures there that were released a few weeks ago, an almost 30%, 29% increase and that's in reported hate crime. And of course it's widely acknowledged that it's a vastly underreported crime. So again, I think it's always very important that we come back to the kind of realities of what we're trying to achieve here. We can't get bogged down, I think, in very abstract and very theoretical debates. This legislation is very much needed and called for, from the community.
Absolutely, and I think that's something that all of us in politics have to, remind people that we, certainly those of us in the community, have friends who've been the victims of hate crimes over the last year or two in particular, where we've seen an increase in this. This law is designed to stop that. This law is designed to place a criminal penalty when attacks are motivated solely on the basis of hate. And that needs to come in to protect people, because people are left vulnerable by the fact that this law isn't present, and we can't allow, again, as with the situation of conversion practices, we can't allow extraneous arguments be brought in to try and blunt or try and prevent the introduction of really important protective legislation.
Absolutely, that's long overdue legislation, really. And I think sometimes people claims are made around whether this legislation is supported but there was actually a more research which was published yesterday. The UL, the European Centre for the Study of Hate here in Ireland, in the University of Limerick. And I think they partnered with Queen's University in Belfast. Those findings actually were very encouraging in terms of public opinion. So 2/3, 67%, said that they support hate offences legislation, whatever the model, whatever model is adopted. And there was over 70% too when you go through all the list of the protected characteristics, and actually 82% for trans people to be covered under the hate crime legislation. Because again, I think the proxy kind of culture war, other kind of issues which are not really relevant to what the bill is trying to achieve. And I think again that just kind of cuts through. In fact, a lot lot of people, I think, believe we already have hate crime legislation. There's kind of a surprise when
people realise we don't have anything on the statute books at the moment. Yeah.
We don't have anything there. So, but I think in terms of, there's two parts to the offence, as you know, to the hate offences bill. One is hate crime, which is addressing the fact that we're an outlier in that respect. I think where a lot of the controversy is around the second element of it, which is the incitement to hatred, and of course we have already for the last 34 years have had legislation, prohibition. So it's not a new departure.
It's not new, but we know the previous legislation, the incitement legislation, was very weak. And I think it's really important just to remind that we do have very strong protections of free speech in our country, in our constitution. And this bill isn't going to trample on that in any way, which is the kind of the erroneous argument that I think has been put out there. But even as it went through the Dáil, amendments were put into this bill to, I suppose, reaffirm the fact that it wasn't interfering with free speech, reaffirm the fact that robust discussion and even critical discussion, and indeed even critical discussion on some of the protected characteristics is protected under this legislation. So you can, criticise issues around gender identity or indeed around being gay, and this legislation doesn't cover you. It's when you incite hatred on those bases, that's when the legislation does apply. And that's right, because just because you disagree with someone, and you're entitled to disagree, I'm an atheist, I disagree on a lot of religious issues, and I'm entitled to do this, and the bill doesn't interfere with my ability to do that, but the bill doesn't allow me incite hatred against any religion, and it is when a person takes that step towards incitement of hatred on any of the protected characteristics, that is when this legislation applies, and I think the vast majority of people in Ireland would see that as correct.
Absolutely. So the second part of the bill is the extreme hate speech element. As you say, there are robust protections there. The Irish Constitution, also the European Court of Human Rights. The right, I think, to shock, offend, and disturb, and of course the legislation is in keeping with that.
But I think it's also important to remember that there is very real hate speech and incitement to hatred taking place, and that we only have to look at social media on a daily basis to see the level of I suppose viciousness that is taking place there. So this isn't again people who are gay, people who are trans, people who are black. This isn't some theoretical issue. No. This is a very real issue. There is incitement out there. Absolutely. And it is important that we have a law that addresses that and addresses it in a proportionate way, and this law is proportionate.
And it's also it captures what's happening online, which and that's where I think the updating of the 1989 Act, which, as you say, both victims of hate crime are incitement to hate, hate offences, and criminal justice practitioners have made the point that legislation it's outdated. The internet wasn't as we understand, the online world wasn't a thing obviously in 1989, and I suppose it just wasn't fit for purpose, and certainly isn't fit for purpose now. So it is crucial that our law kind of does reflect the reality of kind of a more kind of concerted attempt, I think, to spread hatred and to spread disinformation.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we will watch that. We'll watch that debate quite closely. But just as a government minister, government is, I presume, very committed to this legislation and to seeing it delivered.
Absolutely. And look, Minister McEntee and Minister Brown have been the ministers leading this from the Department of Justice. It was a key priority for the Green Party when we negotiated the programme for government back in 2020. So look, I look forward to seeing this being passed by the Seanad. And
before we just move on briefly, I would say as well, I think just in terms of making the legislation effective, and this was actually suggested by the all-party Oireachtas Justice Committee when they were, I think it was actually pre-legislative scrutiny stage, what's called a demonstration test, where that it actually and that's there in England and Wales and Northern Ireland, for example, and because I think it's about ensuring that the bar is appropriately high, but not so high where that you can't actually
get a prosecution,
which I think was a problem with the 89 Act. So certainly, we in the NXF and many other civil society groups who represent kind of the minority communities targeted would very much be calling for the retention of that demonstration test for both the hate crime and the hate offence consequences. And my understanding is that that's very much the view of the Minister McEntee.
Yeah.
Okay, so another issue, I suppose, and this really touches very much on, I suppose, your brief around integration and the whole the issue of migration obviously is very challenging, and we see that, and I think the world that we're in at the moment, there's with the war in Ukraine and so forth, we have a responsibility to take in vulnerable people, but I think within that, I think it has to be said that I think LGBT plus asylum seekers and migrants are particularly vulnerable, are an extremely vulnerable cohort, and even when they do, let's say, come to what they would see as a more kind of welcoming and a more progressive country, issues still arise, I suppose, within the direct provision centre, which I know you're committed to eventually getting rid of, which will be welcome. But what measures, I suppose, or what proposals have you been working on, or are you delivering for, that, and you could say it's part of the broader integration piece, but for the LGBT plus, that particular vulnerability they face?
Well, as you know, we're facing very real challenges in terms of providing accommodation for both people fleeing the war in Ukraine and for wider international protection applicants as well. And there's been a very significant increase in numbers over the last year and a half. Nevertheless, we have legal obligations under international law. We've also moral obligations to make sure we do provide appropriate accommodation for everybody. And we recognise there are different strands of vulnerability among those coming to Ireland, fleeing wars, fleeing persecution elsewhere. When I became minister, I ensured that we now do a vulnerability assessment on all new international protection applicants. That was a requirement of EU law, but Ireland hadn't been implementing that prior to me becoming Minister for Equality and Integration. And that allows for, I suppose, more detailed examination of each individual's circumstances, and if they have particular vulnerabilities, be they a pregnant mother, be they someone with a long-term illness, or be they a member of the LGBTI plus community, that can allow my department and the International Protection Accommodation Service, more appropriately target and structure the supports to them. We do need to do more for LGBTI plus people in the international protection system. We have just completed a piece of work with LGBT Ireland in terms of a report on the current, I suppose, challenges that LGBTI plus asylum seekers face. So I'll be publishing that in the next number of weeks, and be setting out, I suppose, how we as a department, and indeed other departments, will be responding to that. So I think that's an important piece, and that was research that my department funded, recognising that I suppose we knew we need to be doing more in this space.
Okay, and in the current system, let's say, because I know maybe a number of years ago there was kind of an updating of kind of like guidelines, or how I suppose just around the whole kind of equality and diversity kind of training, I suppose, for both, I suppose, residents of direct provision, and then obviously the staff who manage them. And as I said, it does need to be repeated. It's a problematic system in itself, but we have heard stories, obviously, of, I suppose, LGBT plus asylum seekers being subject to discrimination, to to very kind of threatening behaviour, I suppose, because of who they are, and I suppose having come to a country that is certainly more progressive and more diverse, I think that it's appropriate that they would receive that extra support, and that we would make clear that that they're that's not acceptable, basically, that they
and look, steps have been taken and there have been improvements, and I know certainly in terms of the training in many of, I suppose, our more permanent international protection accommodation centres, things have definitely improved. But I think we've had to increase the scale of international protection accommodation very dramatically in the last year because of the very significant number of new applicants arriving, and we have to make sure that those higher standards are maintained across our newer sets of accommodation as well. So, as I say, a number of recommendations are being brought forward in this research that LGBT Ireland have undertaken, and we'll be looking to respond to that in a meaningful way as part of our wider set of reforms we're bringing in to change the direct provision system.
Well, we'll certainly kind of we take note of that, and we look forward to seeing that research come to fruition, because there, as I said, there is that extra vulnerability there.
Absolutely.
And just actually before we move off this topic, obviously integration more generally is a big piece of your work. Do you see that, like, the LGBT, let's say, kind of, we're a country, we're the first in the world, I mean, to pass marriage equality, for example. I think we do very much want to be seen as kind of leaders, kind of global leaders in this field. So in terms of, I suppose, integrating people, who are coming to Ireland, obviously from different parts of the world, I suppose that is something that it's important, isn't it? That in terms of the broader integration piece, whether it's LGBT plus rights or other rights in a liberal democracy, let's say, that we very much kind of highlight that, and that's part of how we integrate people.
It's hugely important, and again, one of the key things I've worked on is to make it easy as possible for international protection applicants to integrate into Irish society from day one. So that's why we have reduced the time period they have to wait before they can work. That's gone from a year before I was minister down to 6 months now. Direct international protection applicants can now get a bank account. They can now get a driver's license. These are things, very basic things, but really important in terms of having as normal a life as possible. We're also going to fund every local authority, every county and city council across the country to have a dedicated integration team. So these are staff of the city or county council, funded by my department, dedicated towards helping international protection applicants integrate and kind of, I suppose, understand. Because, when you come to Ireland, we've got a lot of systems here that we all know because we kind of grew up with them. But for someone who's new here, for someone who's maybe English isn't their first language, it can be a real challenge. And we also have our integration fund. We support community groups and NGOs all over the country in terms of pieces of work they're doing to support the integration of international protection applicants. So integration from day one is really important for us. And even if, I suppose, in terms of abolishing direct provision, it's going to take longer because we have many more people in the system now, it doesn't mean that we can't make real changes and real improvements to the lives of international protection applicants while they're here in Ireland, while they're waiting for their application to be adjudicated on.
Okay, well that's positive. That's positive, certainly, because I think what we want to avoid, isn't it, is isolation and kind of any kind of ghettoisation for people. I think would not be welcome. And just before we move off this topic, Roderic, I'm sure you have been disturbed by some of the very kind of let's say extreme kind of far right kind of nature, because I think everyone, as you say, has the right to protest, and that's very important. But I think when protest does cross over into thuggery or into threatening behaviour, I'm sure you would agree that that's completely unacceptable.
Absolutely. As you say, people have the right to protest, people have the right to disagree with government policies, but people don't have the right to intimidate others, particularly people who are, living in particular places. Some of the protests that we've seen, particularly outside of accommodation centres, has been entirely unacceptable. Accommodation centres where there may be women and children living, and indeed even if there's just men living there, it's not acceptable to intimidate people in some of the ways that we've seen. We know quite a lot of this is orchestrated by a small number of far-right activists across the country. They're able to use social media to maybe amplify their voice beyond their actual numbers. But it is concerning. And look, our department are working closely to do better in terms of providing information about the accommodation we're opening. And I know we haven't always gotten that right, and I'd recognise that. But we're also working closely with An Garda Síochána in terms of making sure we can ensure the safety of international protection applicants in the accommodation they're in.
And I think it's fair to say as well that moves into other strands like LGBT. We've also seen very disturbing so-called protests targeting libraries, for example, an entirely imported tactic from other countries, which I think is upsetting and is seeking to censor and kind of erase LGBT representation and visibility. So again, I think when it crosses over into, and this is where the hate offences legislation, whatever the setting, I think if people cross that line into going beyond legitimate protest into thuggery or into intimidation, I think that the law needs to, I'm sure you would agree, respond appropriately.
Absolutely. Look, we have seen these kind of these protests, these kind of culture war elements. As you say, they are very much imported. I think we've been better in Ireland than other countries in terms of avoiding those and keeping our focus on substantive issues. And I think that's, you know, important for our community as well, that we should keep the focus on the substantive issues, on the important issues, and not maybe get pulled into more kind of extraneous debates that we might have seen in other countries. And I think, you know, that's one of the reasons why we haven't maybe gone down. The debate here hasn't become as toxic as other countries, but I'm also conscious that is changing, and it's not changing in the right way. So we just need to be very careful in terms of the kind of the how issues very much central to people's fundamental rights are discussed in our country.
Certainly no room for complacency.
No.
Finally then, just the last topic that I want to ask you about is the updating of the equalities legislation. I know that's something that you and your department have been working on now for a period of time.
Yeah.
Do you want to maybe just kind of update that?
Yeah, absolutely. So we did a major public consultation last year and got a very significant number of responses. We'll be publishing the kind of the summary of the responses in the next number of weeks. Okay. It's quite a detailed document. You know, it makes difficult reading in places because some of them, some of the submissions are very critical in areas to do with trans rights, to do with LGBTI plus rights. We have to publish it, but we'll kind of have a trigger warning on the document just to, you know, warn people that there'll be some difficult things in there to read. So we'll publish that, and then we will look to, officials in my department will then look to see what are the policy proposals we're going to bring forward on foot of that, and on foot of, you know, wider commitments within the programme for government about looking at the gender ground, about looking at the idea of socio-economic rights and bringing them in as a protected characteristic under equality legislation, about NDAs, non-disclosure agreements, and about a range of other issues that we're looking to address in this revision of the equality legislation.
I think it would be very useful actually, because even in the Shannon debate, I think there was kind of confusion kind of being sowed around kind of definitions and around how they tally or how they kind of marry with other pieces of legislation. Yeah. And of course, I think that the response was quite robust there, where obviously legislation stands on its own, you know. But I think yes, and maybe we could conclude on maybe a kind of a statement of support or solidarity, maybe for the trans community in particular, who find themselves kind of the lightning rod for much of these kind of very toxic and manufactured. A lot of this is manufactured kind of culture war stuff, and it kind of permeates whatever issue kind of we're talking about, whether it's updating the equality legislation, conversion practices, and so on. As we conclude, do you want to maybe just kind of send a message of support and solidarity to our trans?
No, absolutely, and I hope, you know, I'm very conscious that members of the trans community have had to bear the brunt of hatred online and indeed in person over the last number of years. That's why we are bringing in legislation, protective legislation, whether it's a ban on conversion practices, whether it's the hate crime legislation. But I hope they see, you know, across government there is strong support, and, you know, the Taoiseach and the Taoiseach have been very robust, and I think in terms of speaking up for the trans community and making it clear that trans rights are not for debate in our country. And I hope people in the trans community see that it is a view genuinely shared across government.
Yes, in fact, he was Taoiseach now. The Taoiseach last year, actually, during our Pride Leaders Series, made a very strong point that we can do without, like we see what's happening in the US and the UK. We particularly referenced the UK, that, you know, it doesn't serve the country well. It's not productive, and it certainly doesn't support our trans citizens who are in need of that. Mm-hmm. So on that note, Roderic, can I wish you a very happy Pride? I know you will be celebrating, I'm sure, with you and your loved ones, and it really is an opportunity, isn't it, to show that we've come a long way. But ultimately, Pride, it's a statement of intent, isn't it? Yeah. That we are visible. Visibility is our greatest strength, and that's not going anywhere. Yeah. We're going to move forwards. In fact, we're not going to move backwards, and I'm sure you concur with that message.
Absolutely, I'm looking forward to the Pride March in Dublin in the next week, and happy Pride to everybody.
Happy Pride. Thank you. So you're Adam Long with the National LGBT Federation, and I've been joined with Minister Roderic O'Gorman. Happy Pride, everyone.